The UK cities can often feel and look like vast, never-ending grey construction sites. Cranes constantly dot our landscapes, and shiny new glass buildings sprout like mushrooms. Glass, cement, steel, and more glass. These materials trap heat like crazy, creating the so-called heat island effect.
The urban heat island effectively becomes like this island of heat that you find in the cities where we have temperatures which are higher than the surrounding countryside. We have all these building materials that surround us in the cities, where it's the pavement, the asphalt in the streets, the bricks, the concrete, which store quite a lot of heat, which is then released back into the city.
As average global temperatures increase, more heat is accumulated in cities.
The heart of England, today hotter than the Caribbean and Western Sahara.
We've had the UK Met Office issuing its first ever red warning for extreme heat.
Provisional temperature of 40.2 degrees Celsius was reached at Heathrow.
It's becoming increasingly clear that UK cities are not equipped to deal with the heat we have been experiencing lately. And one of the biggest factors are the buildings we live in.
We are one of the few countries that we have quite a large percentage of the building stock still remaining, whether it was through the Georgian, the Victorian, sort of Edwardian building stock, which is still intact or is going through various stages of refurbishment. It's quite a positive fact because they were built with, in the majority of cases, they were built with solid walls. There was quite a lot of thermal mass. There was free ventilation through the windows or the chimney.
But 1 or 2 centuries ago, British architects weren't planning with 40 degrees temperatures in mind.
These buildings, when they were built 100 or 200 years ago, there was no insulation. And you really need insulation in order to maintain better thermal conditions for both winter and summer.
In 2022, the Institute for Government concluded that the UK has the worst home energy efficiency score in Europe. But the lack of insulation in the first place is not the only issue with urban buildings. It's often more profitable for landlords to accommodate multiple tenants within a property. So, a building intended as a large house is nowadays often broken down into multiple flats. And this causes issues with its ventilation systems.
When you start blocking off the various floors and creating sort of out of a single house, creating houses of multiple occupants with quite a few flats that don't have cross ventilation, so they are only facing one side of the house, you end up with quite a lot of heat being accumulated and not necessarily pass for that heat to leave the property.
And newer buildings aren't any less problematic.
In the second half of the 20th century, the greater use of glass and steel in buildings has been problematic now because those are materials that absorb more heat and retain more heat and reflect more heat. So some of those more newer designs have exacerbated the challenge that we face. And in many ways, in our architectural principles, we need to go back to some of that understanding of how you design a building more naturally to keep cool.
Unlike fires, floods and storms, heat causes little direct physical damage to our cities. So unless heat waves are followed by fires, they may seem like a lesser problem for cities. But heat causes serious health issues, in some cases even death. During the heat waves of summer 2022, the UK recorded a staggering 2,800 excess deaths in people over 65.
Once you have high temperatures for a number of days, and then it does not cool down enough during nighttime so that you can get undisturbed sleep, that starts becoming problematic for well-being, even for healthy individuals as well, let alone for those that are more vulnerable.
In a heat wave, we're quick to turn on the AC. But even if you have one, and in the UK that's a rather rare luxury, ACs are not a viable permanent solution to rely on.
Apart from the initial expense to install such units, they are very expensive environmentally in terms of the CO2 emissions. And apart from that, they create a vicious circle because all this heat that they remove from inside the buildings, they dump it outside in the urban environment, in the surrounding open spaces. So it makes the conditions even worse.
So what can the UK do to adapt its cities to extreme heat?
We know other countries have had the cool roof programs about using lighter surfaces for the roofs in order to prevent the heat from rising.
Nations with traditionally warm climates have been doing it for centuries. London already has its cool roofs program. But as temperatures rise everywhere, from Sheffield to Cardiff to Belfast and Glasgow, there's no British city that doesn't need to think about it. Then there's also the need to create more shade.
Whether it would be pergolas, awnings, external blinds, even balconies or cantilevers or projections that would help to shade the windows and the floors below. So external shading has been an important strategy, preventing the sun from entering the building effectively, which will contribute to the overheating. This does not exist, and this is why we rely on internal shading as much as possible.
External shading needs to go beyond our front doorsteps. Public shading is a necessary means for people experiencing extreme heat in cities. Look at London's Cool Spaces map. It shows indoor and outdoor spaces where Londoners can seek respite from the heat and find water fountains. See how on the map the outdoor cool areas overlap with the city's parks and water sources. On the opposite, the hot zones are the grey zones, usually densely populated areas with little to no green and blue spaces around. And yes, a lot of concrete.
Particularly at risk are the areas in cities where we see very little in terms of trees.
After the unprecedented heatwave in summer 2022, the Mayor of London launched a £3.1 million tree planting package, which aims to better protect Londoners from some of the devastating impacts of the climate crisis. But it's not just London. Glasgow has pledged to invest in green infrastructure as part of its own Glasgow Green Deal. In 2019, England launched a countrywide competitive Urban Tree Challenge Fund, where cities can receive grants to help them meet their tree planting goals.
Trees are important for the streets as well in terms of providing footpaths for the people to walk under.
It works like a domino effect. The cooler our streets are, the more people would be inclined to walk or cycle. This would lead to an incentivized car reduction on the streets that would help reduce the heat island effect too. As summers in the UK keep getting hotter, we need to act quickly. This is where technology's role comes in. Will's team is developing digital tools to help city planners adapt infrastructure to heat.
We have a tool which we call Arup Solar that understands at a level of detail how a building is going to absorb heat from the sun, where it's going to reflect heat from the sun, and how we can design facades that allow our buildings to stay cooler, and indeed how we can design facades that use solar PV to generate energy themselves. We've developed a tool called Terrain. Terrain takes satellite data to understand at a very granular level the detail of a place or a city. It uses machine learning to identify the micro features of the landscape, and it then uses optimal design to figure out where we can put in blue interventions and green interventions, alongside the traditional built-in environment, in order to develop what people call nature-based solutions. An example of that would be a piece of work we're doing, interestingly, in Tirana for the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, where we're designing an orbital forest to surround Tirana. That's to provide shade, it's to provide carbon sequestration, it's to provide places for families to play, it's to cool the city as well.
It may seem a bit counterintuitive to have to use technology to deploy more nature in cities. But using digital tools to help us map and understand the areas we live in can help us save precious time we can't afford to waste anymore.
In the past, if you wanted to map a local area, you'd have to send out squadrons of people, either with paper or with laptops, all collecting things separately. We can now use the extraordinary opportunity of satellite data and other data sources to understand that in a way more comprehensive way, at a really detailed level.
The path to cooler cities seems clear, but having all these solutions doesn't necessarily mean the local governments deploy them.
At times, it feels like we're moving backwards rather than forwards. We see lots of sort of very short-term initiatives which just about extend the end of a government at best, which is not really how we should be moving forward. We're talking about climate change being the biggest threat to humanity. As the climate scientists have highlighted, it's getting worse much quicker than the models predicted. So we really shouldn't be cutting back. We should really be investing and implementing such initiatives for individual homes at larger scale.
As global temperatures continue to rise and climate records are smashed year-round, we have no time to waste. Our cities face a choice: either contribute to worsening the climate crisis or become part of the solution.